All across this country, thousands of people are living in apartments and houses with serious fire safety and structural defects. Some of these have made the news, many more have not. Defects, Living with the Legacy of the Celtic Tiger, tells the horrifying story of these people and how they came to be trapped in dangerous homes. Its author is the Fine Gael spokesperson on housing, Eoin O'Broin, and Eoin O'Broin joins me now. Eoin O'Broin, good evening to you, and you're very welcome indeed to the programme.
Thank you very much. We may have to start by me suing you for defamation, calling me the Fine Gael housing.
I beg your pardon. The Sinn Fein housing spokesperson. My sincere apologies. That's a serious error of judgment. That is actually almost defamatory. I understand fully. Eoin, you're welcome nonetheless to the programme. One reviewer of the book, Mick Clifford, the journalist, describes this book as a devastating critique of a political system in which the power of vested interests ensured that the state abrogated its duty to protect homeowners and tenants. And I want to look at that presently, but can we start perhaps by you identifying for people the terrible experiences of so many people as a result of what went on during the course of the Celtic Tiger?
Absolutely, and I suppose to keep it nice and simple, there are really two sets of defects that people have and continue to be living with today. The first one, which is well known to many of your listeners, are those homeowners who are living in properties that were built with defective block, whether they're affected by mica or pyrite. And literally the consequence of those poorly built block and poorly built homes is houses are literally crumbling around the families who are living in them. The other set of defects are what we call construction defects. So it's not so much there was a problem with the building materials, but the process of construction itself wasn't done to meet the standards. And in the main, they're households that have serious fire safety defects, or they would have what we call water ingress, water slowly seeping into the structure of the building and corroding it over a period of time. And the financial implications for a household can be anything from the lower end of 10, 20 or 30,000 for fire stopping and fire safety to 100, 200, 300,000 where an entire home has to be demolished and rebuilt because of defective block. And essentially, I suppose the problem was that the system of ensuring that manufacturers produce products or builders built homes to the standards that existed was so lax and so weak during the Celtic Tiger that thousands, if not tens of thousands of homes were built with defective materials or with defective building process. And tonight, right across the country, in almost every county, families are living in buildings that are not only not meet the regulations, but are literally unsafe. And they don't know where they're going to get the money to remediate these properties into the future.
And in the book, you identify people who suffered hugely from so many different perspectives, whether it was psychological, financial, or otherwise. There has been a dreadful human cost in all of this.
Absolutely. One of the things I wanted to do was devote a very large portion of the book. It's about half of the length of the book to those stories, and I was very privileged. 6 families let me into their lives, and in some cases literally let me into their homes. A family from Donegal, a family from County Clare, and then 4 families from Dublin. And I suppose I try and tell their story from the excitement of buying their first home, the sense of security and stability that gave them, through to the shock of discovering the defects, but also then the dawning realization, the frustration, the anger and the disbelief that in fact nobody was going to be held responsible, not the block manufacturers or quarry manufacturers, not the builders or the developers, and that ultimately they were going to be left dealing with the costs. Probably the most powerful story is that of Stephanie Meehan. Stephanie and her then partner Fia Crowley were among the early residents into Priory Hall, an apartment complex built in Dublin during the Celtic Tiger that had such severe fire safety defects. The families had to be evacuated in 2011. They spent 2 years in emergency accommodation. And at the high point of a campaign by the owners to get the government just to meet them and talk to them, Stephanie Meehan's partner, Fia Crowley, took his own life under the stress of simply not being able to provide a secure home for his own family. And while up until that point, the then Minister for Environment, Phil Hogan, well, he'd been refusing to meet the family when Stephanie wrote a really powerful letter to Enda Kenny, the then Taoiseach, after Fiacre's death. That letter then went public, and that shamed the government into meeting the families. And within a matter of weeks, Keep in mind, these families had been living in emergency accommodation for 2 years after evacuation. But within a matter of weeks, the government had found a resolution to the problem, and 100% redress had been provided for those families. And while obviously that allowed all of the other families to move on, for Stephanie and her 2 young children, it came 2 years too late. She had lost her partner. Her children had lost their loving father. And while Stephanie has moved on in her life to some degree, but continues to speak about this issue, if only to try and ensure this never happens to any other family, she's never going to get over the loss of her partner, Fiachra. And what that speaks to is the need for government to accept it has some responsibility to resolve the issues for all of those other thousands of families who are living with defects today, and to step up to the plate and ensure not only do those families get the 100% redress, which they rightly deserve, but that we ensure that there are further reforms to our building control regime so no other family into the future has to suffer the very extreme consequences that Stephanie and Oisin and Ceres experienced at Priory Hall, but also all of those other stresses and strains and trauma that families, whether they've got pyrite in Mayo, mica in Donegal, or fire safety and water ingress defects anywhere else in the state, no other family has to go through what those families are going through tonight.
And one aspect of Stephanie's experience was that when all of this happened, there was nobody she could turn to. She felt utterly helpless, she and her partner at the time.
That's right, and that's why both in the book, but also in 2018, the Oireachtas Housing Committee unanimously endorsed a report that I had authored for the committee following hearings called Safest Houses, which called for the establishment of a latent defects redress scheme, whereby anybody who discovers defects could just pick up the phone to an independent body. That body would provide them with full independent advice. In the first instance, would seek to ensure that the manufacturer or the builder or the developer responsible would foot the bill of remediation. And where that manufacturer or builder or developer was no longer trading, there would be a fund contributed to both by industry and government that would foot the full cost of remediation. Thankfully, there are now at least 2 networks. There is the Construction Defects Alliance, which is a network of homeowners who are affected by the kind of fire safety and water ingress issues. It's a voluntary network. They have a great website. People should engage with them if they're affected by those. And we also obviously have county by county in Donegal, in Mayo, in Clare and elsewhere, networks of homeowners who are providing that support to ensure people share information and know what's going on. Both of those groups, the defective block groups as I call them, and the Construction Defects Alliance, are both involved in separate reviews with government currently about the level of redress that they may or may not get into the future. And like all of these things, it's only when there's a sufficient political pressure on government from affected people and those who support them have we found the government move. So now is the time to get involved in those networks if you want to help them out, because both of those groups are working under very tight deadlines to try and resolve at least the initial phase of these schemes before budget is announced in October. So I'd appeal to anybody who's either affected or knows people who's affected, wants to help, link in either with the pyrite or mica action groups in the local counties or the Construction Defects Alliance for those broader set of Celtic Tiger defects issues.
And on 2 important questions which you pose and indeed answer. First of all, who was responsible? And secondly, why were they allowed to get away with it?
Well, for me, in general, there are 2 groups of people responsible. First is the manufacturers and the developers and builders. I mean, they ultimately were responsible for all of this, and they should not be allowed to walk away scot-free. Nobody's ever been prosecuted for any of these defects, any of the defects that I detail in the book, and we know of, separate to the thousands of families affected by defective block, we know of 90 residential developments across the state affected by water ingress or fire safety. Not a single developer has ever been held to account or been made to pay. Some developments have had voluntary contributions from developers fearful of reputational damage if the names of those developments and developers became public. So that has to be addressed. But the second thing is government cannot walk away. Probably the main contribution my book tries to make to understanding how we ended up in the mess we ended up in is to tell the political story of how it ended, how it emerged, that industry-led self-certification was allowed to happen. And the reason why is, despite the fact that very many people, from the Law Reform Commission to the Tribunal of Inquiry into the Stardust fire in 1981 to a variety of opposition politicians, despite the fact that all of these people argued against self-certification and called for independent local authority-led building control, governments, both the Fine Gael Labour government in the first half of the 80s and then the Fianna Fáil government in the latter half of the 80s and early 90s, they allowed self-certification to reign during the Celtic Tiger era period. So government has to accept its portion of responsibility, and that's why we need a state redress scheme, but industry also has to pay its fair share.
In terms of the criticism levelled at the political system, and as I mentioned at the start, Mick Clifford describes your book as a devastating critique of the political system. In what way did the political system fail the citizens of this country, or certainly some of those who had this grave misfortune visited on them?
So the story is a long one, and I won't go into the finer detail of it, but essentially it goes something like this. Back in the 1960s, we didn't have a building control regime, and outside a few local authorities that had some bylaws, there was no system to ensure buildings that were built according to standards, to fire safety standards and construction standards. The story then that follows is periodically we have very, very tragic events in which people die because of faulty building, and that provokes government to act. So in the 1960s, a number of tenements in Dublin collapsed, a number of children tragically lost their lives, and that spurred the government in the Local Government Planning and Development Act of the early to mid-1960s to give the Minister for Local Government the power to introduce a statewide building control regime to ensure everything that was built in accordance with the standards that government set down. Nothing happened until the mid-1970s when the government outlined a draft building control regime which was predominantly local authority-led independent inspection. That was trashed by industry, builders, architects, engineers, quantity surveyors. They didn't like it. They said it would be too expensive for them, it would slow down construction, and anyway, local authorities didn't have the staff, and government allowed the matter to sit on the shelf. The Law Reform Commission, a very important body, in 1977, produced a very important report saying, in fact, there should be a legal obligation on builders to build in accordance with the regulations. Very clear, very simple. Again, that report was trashed by industry and by others, and government then decided not to act. It took the death of 48 young people in the Stardust nightclub in Artane in North Dublin City on Valentine's night in 1981 to push the government into action again. The government of the day set up a tribunal of inquiry. There were many problems with the outcome of that tribunal of inquiry, but one of the most damning sections of Justice King's report was his strong criticism of the failure of government to introduce the draft building control regulations for the late 70s. He goes as far as to say, if the 1976 building control regulations had been in place and enforced at the time of the Stardust fire, the tragedy would not have been as severe. And he called for the fire safety elements of those regulations to be introduced within 3 months, and the rest within a slightly longer time frame. Instead of doing what Justice King called for, instead of doing what the Law Reform Commission called for, the Fine Gael and Labour government instead chose to move down the route of self-certification. And the reason they did so is because they were under the thumb of industry. It's very, very clear from all of the records. What then happens from 84 to 1990 is possibly one of the longest passages of legislation that I've ever come across, where the Building Control Act of 84 goes to the House of the Oireachtas. And one of the most powerful exchanges in that is at the latter end. I think it was 1989, 1990. Eamon Gilmore is then in the Workers' Party. He's their opposition spokesperson on environment. He's against what he sees as the privatisation of building control. And he has this exchange with Pádraig Flynn, who we know, of course, subsequently was exposed for accepting corrupt payments from developers during the heady days of the Celtic Tiger. And Eamon Gilmore says on the floor of the Dáil, if this legislation goes through, a rogue builder and a rogue architect can build a defective property, and if I buy that property, I have no comeback. Pádraig Flynn then says in response, I don't know why the deputy is so obsessed with rogue builders. I haven't met any. Pádraig Flynn goes on to say, builders have to trade on their reputation. If they build poor quality products, they won't get working again. Unfortunately, the government didn't listen to Eamon Gilmore. They pressed ahead with self-certification. And by the time the regulations were fully in effect, 1992, the country was emerging out of recession, and we had the start of the Celtic Tiger building boom. And exactly as Eamon Gilmore predicted, very, very large numbers of rogue builders and rogue architects built very, very large numbers of defective homes, and thousands, if not tens of thousands of people paid very significant sums of money and have continued to pay very, very high mortgages to live in buildings that weren't built properly. So nobody who supported the building control bill when it made its final passage to the bill, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and some in Labour, none of them can say they were not warned. They were warned by the Law Reform Commission, they were warned by the Dublin City Fire Brigade, they were warned by Justice Keane in the tribunal inquiry recommendations, and they were warned by Proinsias de Rossa in particular and Eamon Gilmore not to do it this way. They failed to heed that advice. They decided to listen to industry instead, and therefore they failed the people who today are living in defective buildings built during the Celtic Tiger. And that's why I take a very strong view that unfortunately the state has to step up and play its part in 100% redress for all of those affected. But more importantly, put in place the kind of reforms to ensure that kind of defective building, that kind of defective block manufacturing can never happen again in the future.
Eoin, I was reading in the book, the first of the 5 committee meetings dealing with the Building Control Bill took place in December 1988, but it didn't reach the statute books until 1990. And would it be fair to say that the building boom of the 90s and indeed into the noughties really tested the Building Control Act of 1990 in the most extreme of circumstances?
Absolutely, and while obviously that period of the 1980s there was other political turmoil going on and there were general elections and changes of government, the fact that it took over a decade for that legislation to pass really shows the government was in no rush to put in place even the limited form of building control through self-certification. But the same thing is happening today. That same Law Reform Commission report that I mentioned back in the 1970s also argued for a statutory register of construction industry professionals, which would include an independent complaint mechanism, so that if you had a complaint about a construction industry professional that you had employed, there would be an independent body you could go to, make a complaint, and a decision could be made to keep it out of the courts and do it through a statutory register. That statutory register was promised by Phil Hogan in 2014. It didn't happen during the 70s or 80s. And while the register exists on a non-statutory footing, we still don't have the statutory register, despite the fact that it was promised now, 7 years ago by Phil Hogan, Simon Coveney and Owen Murphy, when they were the minister, promised to advance the legislation. And while we've done pre-legislative scrutiny on the general scheme, we still don't have the statutory register. So it seems to be when the government wants to rush stuff through, when they wanted to rush through bank guarantees or liquidation of Anglo-Irish Bank at great cost to the taxpayer, they can do that okay. In fact, every December and every July, the government, at breakneck speed, push all sorts of controversial legislation to the door with limited scrutiny. But when it comes to something that the construction industry, by and large, don't want or are cold about or lukewarm about, it takes an incredibly long period of time. And here's the problem. We are about to embark on a very significant increase in the level of residential construction. I hope the overwhelming majority of that is good quality, affordable homes for working families, as well as an increase in social homes. But construction is going to increase. Would it not be better now to ensure that we have the best quality building control regime, so all of the standards that already apply are adhered to by everybody who's involved in residential construction, so all of those new homes that are built in the coming years aren't just affordable, and that's a really important point, but they're built to the fire safety and construction standards that are set out in law. I mean, if you think about it this way, if you leave your radio station today and you go and buy anything, from a book to a bar of chocolate to a car or a fridge, and you take it home and it's not built properly, what do? You take it back to the shop that you bought it from and you get a credit note or you get a replacement. The only purchase that principle does not apply is the single biggest purchase of your life, your family home. It is the only purchase where if it is defective, the liability to fix those defects ultimately is on the purchaser of the property, even though they're not responsible for that purchase. And of course, that's before we start talking about the private rental tenants living in these defective buildings or social housing tenants who are living in these defective buildings with the health implications and stresses and strains on them as well. So now is the time to learn the lessons of the weak regulatory regime of the Celtic Tiger era. Let's not wait till the regime we have now is be sorely tested by the building boom that we're hoping that is about to commence in the coming months and years. Let's give the families who are affected by the last bad round of building the 100% redress that they deserve, particularly families affected by defective block in Mayo and Donegal and Western Seaboard counties. But let's then make all of the reforms that were demanded in the 70s and 80s by the Law Reform Commission and others to ensure all of the new homes that are built to the appropriate standards.
And where would the difficulty be with that? Would there be opposition to that? Because it seems to me that this is a matter for government and the Oireachtas. I know people might say, well, it isn't a matter for government. It's unfortunate that it's happened, but the resolution lies elsewhere. But your argument is that because weak controls were introduced by the Oireachtas and moved by government, that it is in fact a matter for government and by necessity the state.
Look, let's be very clear. Like the primary responsibility is with the material suppliers or the building contractors who build or supply defective homes and products. But that's very clear. But the extent to which they can get away with that is determined by the regulatory regime that's there. So even today, while the self-certification that exists in the Celtic Tiger is no longer with us, we have a new system of assigned certification where professionals are employed by developers to inspect and submit their certs. In many cases, those certifiers are employed by the same architectural practice that the developer employs, or they're directly employed by the developer. So it's not independent of the development. And that's not in any way to cast aspersions on the integrity of the overwhelming majority of builders and tradespeople and certifiers who do a very, very good job. We build lots and lots of really good homes that are fully compliant with the rules all the time. But if your building control regime is not fully independent, then it is easier to break those rules. It is easier to build homes that are defective. It is easier to supply products such as block that don't meet those standards. And unfortunately, I spend a little bit of time at the end of the book. Unfortunately, many of us are beginning to hear stories. They are small and isolated incidents of post-2014 developments that are being built that are not compliant with the rules. So I'm not saying the practice is widespread. In fact, I'm very careful not to scaremonger in the book. But I wouldn't want to wait until such a practice is widespread to root it out. If it's small and at the edges of our construction regime now, let's make sure it's even smaller and even more marginal and root it out completely. But the extent to which rogue builders and rogue architects can build those defective products that Eamon Gilmore warned about back in 1989, 1990 is determined by how good or bad our building control regime is. And in our local authorities, our building control sections are the poor cousin of our planning sections. That should not be the case. There should be an absolute guarantee through independent inspections by properly resourced local authorities that when you buy a home, when you rent a home, or when you move into your allocated local authority home, it is built in accordance with the standards. And see, if it's not, the people responsible should have to pay to remediate it, irrespective of when they built that property. And we're not in that place now, to the very best of my opinion, and to the opinion of many of the experts that I talk to and quote in the book. Why do I think we're not there? I think because there still is a view in the larger parties that have dominated government over recent years that where the industry doesn't want something, even if government says, yes, let's do it, it doesn't happen. You know, there's that great moment in the earlier exchanges of the Building Control Bill between Fine Gael's Minister of State, Fergus O'Brien, who introduces the Building Control Bill, and Bobby Malloy, who's the Fine Gael opposition spokesperson. And Bobby Malloy has this great thing saying, you know, we have to have a building control regime as a matter of urgency, but let's not do it too quickly because it will upset the building industry. It will increase costs and slow down output. Well, you can't have both of those things, and you have to decide which side are you on. Are you on the side of ensuring that every home is built according to the standards, no matter what? That's the side I'm on. Or are you on the side that says, yes, let's build to standards, but if industry thinks that the standards are too onerous or the enforcement of those standards could impact on cost or timelines, then let's not go too hard on the standards. That's, I think, where this government and the last government were. That's what's got us into the trouble in the Celtic Tiger, and I don't want us to allow that to continue into the future.
One final point, Eoin. Are you saying now, because there's a likelihood to be intensive building as a result of the need to provide for housing, that the legislation that's there at the moment is not in fact sufficiently robust to ensure that this couldn't happen again?
So my strong view is that the building control regime that was introduced by Phil Hogan in 2014, first of all, hasn't been fully implemented. So he wanted not only assigned certifiers to be clearly identified to inspect, but he also wanted a statutory register of construction industry professionals and a very, very strong National Building Control Office. We have that new certification regime, though in my view it's not independent enough. We do have the Building Control Office, but it's chronically understaffed, and we don't have the statutory register of construction industry professionals and the independent complaints mechanism. So even the reforms that were promised by Phil Hogan haven't been fully introduced. But even if they had, I don't think they go far enough. When I was producing the report for the Oireachtas Housing Committee back in 2017, 2018, Safest Houses, I interviewed building control officers in a range of places, including Belfast. And I went to Belfast because I used to be a Belfast City Councillor some years ago. And when I was interviewing the building control officer in Belfast, he told me he'd just come back from leave. And he took leave to build his own home in the neighbouring local authority where he and his family lived. During the course of the construction of his family home, the local authority in which he lives independently inspected that property 5 times. 5 separate times they independently inspected, unannounced, and they certified. And he said, this is great because I know this is built properly, right? Here in the south, first of all, self-build and one-off properties don't need any certification, although you can opt to do it if you want. There is no obligation on the local authority to inspect any estate buildings. They are meant to inspect up to 12%. Some do, some don't, but they don't have to do it. And the formal certification process is done by a professional who is paid for by the developer, which isn't independent. So if you ask me, if I was buying a home, which system would I prefer? I prefer the system in which there was 5 independent inspections during construction, and I could verify all of that through the documentation. It's a much more robust system. And until we have that kind of a system, properly resourced both through our local authorities and the centralised building control office, then I think the potential for bad building and bad product production is to continue. Would it be on the scale of the Celtic Tiger? I don't know. I have no evidence to say that's the case at the moment. But why take that risk? Why take that chance? Would it not be better to design that out of our construction system now? And I think the sooner we do that, the better for everybody. Can I also say it would also be good for the good builders out there, because there are lots and lots of really good quality builders, sole traders, as well as companies who produce a really good product. They also lose out by bad building control because it allows the rogue traders to cut corners. So in my view, a strong building control regime is both good for the purchaser or for the social or private rental tenant, but it's also good for the good building contractor, architect, designer. And ultimately, it's better for the taxpayer, because we've had to pay 68 million euros to date to remediate Pyrite in Leinster. We're going to spend hundreds of millions of euros to remediate defective block in the Western Seaboard from Donegal, Mayo, right down to Clare and Limerick. And we're going to spend even more again to remediate the fire safety defects. So in fact, in the long run, it's cheaper to do things properly from the start. And that's why I think the case for further reform of our building control system is irrefutable at this point in time.
Very good. We must leave it there. The book is entitled Defects, Living with the Legacy of the Celtic Tiger, authored by Eoin O'Broin, the Sinn Fein spokesperson on national housing, by Merrion Press, retailing at €16.95. Eoin O'Broin, many thanks indeed for joining us this evening on the programme and giving of your time over the past half hour.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
And a good evening to you. OK, that brings the time now to 28 minutes to 6 o'clock. We'll take a break.